Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Community Design Center of Rochester Board of Directors and the staff, I'd like to welcome you to the 16th Annual Reshaping Rochester Lecture Series. My name is Maria Furgiuele, and I am the Executive Director of the CDCR. This year's theme is Building a Just Community. In 2015, the theme for the lecture series was Balancing the Scales, Equity by Design. This is where we first began to explore the intersection between placemaking and equity. We believe that the theme of this year's lecture series, Building a Just Community, can be a catalyst for much needed conversation and an inspiring action that can have a positive impact on our community. All of our programs for 2021 and beyond will be in support of this theme. The Community Design Center of Rochester was founded in 2003 and is celebrating nearly 2 decades of service to the greater Rochester region. We promote design excellence and sustainability of the built environment through advocacy, education, and a grassroots community facilitation. I'd like to introduce you to our board of directors. Bill Price, Monika McCullough, Stephanie Annunziata, and Vanessa Villeneuve make our executive team. And our at-large board members are Natalie Anderson, Howard Decker, Eugenio Marlin, Miriam Yakub, and Tanya Zweilin. I want to thank the board for their commitment, guidance, and continued support. We would like to recognize and thank the New York State Council on the Arts, who has made our work possible through their generous support. Our circle of friend members are persons or businesses that have made a commitment of sustained support to our organization. We gratefully acknowledge their support, and we extend an invitation to any of you who value the work of the Design Center to join our circle. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, Home Leasing. We are truly grateful for Home Leasing's commitment to the series and their generous support. We gratefully acknowledge the ESL Charitable Foundation for their generous support of the series. And we are especially grateful to the Community Preservation Corporation for their continued support as a gold level sponsor. Special thanks to the Greater Rochester Association of Realtors for their longstanding support and for being our event sponsor today. The GRAR, as well as the National Association of Realtors, have been generous sponsors of many of our large-scale engagement projects. And I'd like to acknowledge all of our previous and future sponsors, Hebron and Company, Reconnect Rochester, and the City of Rochester for their generous support of the series. We'd like to acknowledge our exclusive media partner, WXXI, and AIA Rochester for being our sponsor for professional development credits. And we'd like to, at this time, thank all of our supporting sponsors and lecture series friends. We are truly grateful for your support. I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize Monika Reifenstein in particular for being our Zoom wizard behind the scenes, our lecture planning committee that works year-round to plan this series, and of course our board of directors for their guidance. And a quick reminder to please take the survey at the end of the presentation. Your feedback is critically important in helping us inform our programming. The following slides are for those individuals who are like to take advantage of the professional development credits. This presentation is approved for APA and AICP professional development credits as well, and CES credits by the AIA. If you wish to receive credits for this presentation, please note the Google Doc that Monika has posted in the chat. Here is a brief description of the course content. And here are the learning objectives for today's programs. And now it is my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Destiny Thomas is an anthropologist planner from Oakland, California, currently serving as CEO of Thrivance Group, which she founded in 2013. Thrivance Group works to bring culturally restorative concepts into the lived experience of their clients and community partners. She also has experience working within government agencies, including Caltrans as an environmental planner and in the city of Los Angeles as a transportation planner. In addition, Dr. Thomas has led key advancements in racial equity initiatives across the state by way of community organizing, policy writing, and nonprofit management in communities that have been most impacted by racial inequities. In 2002, Dr. Thomas launched a culturally rooted, trauma-informed enterprise geared towards building capacity for those values within municipal agencies, direct service providers, and advocacy organizations. Dr. Thomas earned a BA in political science from Fisk University in 2006, an MPA with an emphasis in public health and nonprofit management from Tennessee State University in 2008, and a PhD in social and cultural anthropology from the California Institute of Integral Studies in 2016. She is also a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Society, Incorporated. Dr. Thomas's area of interests include racial equity, implementing the dignity-infused community engagement methodology, anti-displacement studies, healing environmental and infrastructural trauma, and bolstering agency and voice in marginalized communities within municipal planning processes. And with this, it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Thomas.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with you all today. Thank you for that introduction, Maria. As was mentioned, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about sort of the state of play when it comes to the legacy of racism in urban planning and city making in the United States. I actually usually start with a little bit about myself because I do have a very interesting and unique introduction into the field. And so while I do that, I'll also correct some of the things in my bio because the time frame has to be right. So actually, we are a new business. We did not incorporate Thrivance Group until 2020, actually a couple of weeks before the pandemic started. I did, however, begin thinking about what it means to work with people at the community level through their trauma. And I've always been a scholar since high school. I actually took a lot of my high school classes at the local junior college. And I've always been fascinated with the connection between trauma and the built environment. And so usually when people do some digging around about Thrivance Group, they'll see Thrivance Project pop up, which is actually a research project that I started in while I was in my doctoral program. And that moment in time is such a critical point of time in my, transformation and growth as a city maker. I often tell people that I grew up in the Tamir Rice era, but what's probably more accurate in terms of pinpointing the moment I knew I wanted to be involved in city making for the rest of my life was the loss and death of Oscar Grant in Oakland, California, where I'm from. When Oscar Grant was shot and killed on the BART station platform in West Oakland, Fruitvale Station, it really shattered my life. It really was earth-shattering for me. One, because at that age, I had maybe on one other occasion, but very rarely experienced the type of collective grief and trauma that my community went through. But it also changed my perspective because mobility and transportation and just being able to get from, point A to point B, those were like aspirations that you look toward as a young person, right? Like if I can leave the house, if I can catch the bus on my own, like I know I'm grown, right? And so just the thought of BART, which was really beloved to young folks in the Bay Area at the time. The thought of BART being the site of such a traumatic death, it really stuck with me. I'm going to tell you another story a little bit later, but this theme of healing and atonement through planning and policy is something that is germane to the Thrivance Group. For those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we are a for-profit planning firm. We say we work in the interest of racialized people, and we do that in 3 ways. We still have the Thrivance Project, which is our pillar or our body of work that allows us to do traditional projects, right? Contract with cities, do business to business things, do research at projects. But 2 other aspects of our work that folks rarely hear about are Thrivance Legacy and Thrivance Space. And Thrivance Legacy is really our intention to create a youth-centered approach to urban planning by elevating young people and young adults to the planning sector through alternative pathways. So I'm an anthropologist. I didn't go to urban planning school. Actually, a little older than I look. So there weren't planning schools. There weren't many planning schools when I was college age. And so I studied, public policy and public health and political science and eventually anthropology. And I realized through that journey that, we're often telling Black young folks the pathway to making a change in your community is to be a lawyer, to be a doctor, to be a teacher. But these incidences, like the loss of Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old and playing outside in a park when he was shot and killed, Oscar Grant, Breonna Taylor, Nia Wilson, watching ourselves die, right, on TV during the technology boom when all of the social media is starting to spring up. There wasn't anywhere or anyone that sat me down and said, this is a meaningful pathway to changing some of the circumstances that lead to these people, to these young people losing their lives so early. And so I actually encountered urban planning on accident. I was living in Chicago. I was doing community organizing in Chicago and knew that I wanted to be in civil service. I do come from a civil service family, so I wasn't sure what my job would be, but I know that my aspiration had to have something to do with working for the city. And so I applied for every city job that my political science degree would get me access to. And the only agency that called me back was Caltrans. And the legend goes, the story goes that I showed up to the interview that day and I was interviewing to be an environmental planner. And the person interviewing me eventually was my supervisor. And she stops and she asks me, okay, so tell us what CEQA is. And I'm like, I don't know what CEQA is, And she's like, you don't know what CEQA is? And I said, no, but I'm really good at using Google. I can Google CEQA, I can read about it, and I can apply what I learned. And she kind of, she sat back and she was, I think, maybe annoyed, but also impressed with my honesty. And she said, you know what, instead of going through these interview questions, let's have a conversation. And I told her my life story and I told her how important it was for me to be able to do work that meant that I belonged outside, and that I could have a relationship with the land that wasn't complicated, and that I could travel and move about and have access to the same opportunities as everyone else. And she took a chance with me. She hired me. One of the best moves of my life. It was in Fresno, California, though, which I also had never been to before. So imagine coming from 30 degrees in Chicago and landing in 105 degrees in the middle of the summer. Also very much a culture shock. But I'm telling you this story because a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is about the legacy of racism in planning. And I truly believe that the legacy of racism in planning is that way because the field itself has done such a good job of gatekeeping and keeping the people who are most likely to be impacted by decisions out of the decision-making seat. So the photo that we have here on the screen is Aaron Douglas's painting. I don't know if I have any like fans of art in the room. Also, a little known fact about me is I love art. I'm actually a painter myself, so I'm really inspired by art. But Aaron Douglas is a former professor at Fisk University, which is the college that I went to. It's a historically Black university. And this painting is called Into Bondage. And when I was in school, this painting would be on a lot of the cover of a lot of the textbooks that we would read, or two or three of the textbooks that we read have this painting on it. And it's called Into Bondage. And what struck me about this painting is that there are so many images and depictions of the harm and the trauma that Black folks experience in the built environment or outside in general. And I've always been troubled by the notion that in order for people to see our humanity or to empathize with us or to want to center us in their work, they had to watch us bleed out, right? You got to hear our mothers wailing in the street. You got to see us, you know, in handcuffs, being pressed against the cold concrete by police officers' knees. You have to hear us take our last breath, right? And then in addition to that, we have to prove to you that before that moment happened, we were respectable citizens, right? All of those prerequisites for our humanity to be seen. And then there's nothing to be said about what steps or actions one would take after being aware of our trauma. So this painting is something that I could never afford to get a print of and hang up in my own home, but one that I admire deeply. It's just to explain what you're looking at. This is Aaron Douglas's depiction of what enslaved Africans were, you know, thinking and going through right before they boarded the ships that brought them to the Americas, which is, of course, a very sad moment. You see people in the front of the photo, or in the, what is that, the foreground of the photo. They're in shackles, their heads are hanging low, they're walking toward the ships. And I think that is the posture that we are used to seeing Black folks in, or that we ask to see people of color in, before we can even engage in a conversation about what you need and how we can help, and what healing looks like in this moment. But what you also see is a woman in the far left-hand corner of the painting with her hands raised and stretched up to the sky, right? And it begs the question of, why would she be celebrating in this moment, right? Like, what exactly is she doing? And then there's a male figure in the middle of the painting who's kind of gazing up at what I believe to be the North Star, right? There's a beam of light emanating on him. And I think it's the complexity that this painting is offering us, right? This mixture of deep suffering, immense trauma, but also humanity and dignity and hope. I think those very basic truths and realities can carry us to the solutions that we need in order to be a more equitable field. In fact, at the Thrivance Group, we have an organizational virtue, which is dignity. And anytime someone hires us to do a training about equity, or what is the new term, DEI or IDEA, we don't come in talking about equity. One, because I am a critical race scholar and believe that, you know, ultimately race is a social construct, and that the more we speak in ways that affirm the conditions associated with race, the worse our conditions will get. And so dignity, I feel, is an appropriate way to frame one's humanity without buying into the construct of race and therefore racism. What the key takeaway here of this image is that we have a ritual, we have a cultural norm in the Black community of asserting our dignity in the midst of deep grief and long suffering, right? And I want us to sit with this for a second, because everyone for the last year, well, in the Black community for many years prior, but for the last year, there's been some kind of awakening happening. Now, all of a sudden, everyone is privy to the trauma, right? And this is because, of course, it's on TV and we have social media, right? But there's this discourse about, now that I've seen that these are the conditions, I want to do something about it. And what's really dangerous about that is we are talking about a people who still hold, carry, and embody joy in the deepest, darkest moments of their lives. So if we are in the moment of waves of Black people pouring into the streets, openly crying and screaming for justice, willing to die for it, in the midst of a pandemic at that, we're seeing babies and mothers and fathers weeping on the news, right? We're watching the videos of people dying every day. If we are at a point in this nation's history where you are witnessing the open suffering of Black folks, you have to understand that it is much more grave than what you think it is. Because we have a culture of celebration, right? Our grandmothers tell us, everything in decency and order. Maybe I think that comes from a Bible scripture. I don't know. I just know it came from my grandma. We've been socialized to not suffer publicly. So the suffering that you are encountering publicly is just the tip of the iceberg of what we're actually experiencing in society and in the built environment. Here's what I need you to know before I leave today. Black people have a very complicated relationship to land and place. It's not simple. It's not simple in the ways we would like them to be. It's inconvenient. It's hard to quantify with data. It's hard to make a business case for, right? So what a bike lane is to you is not a bike lane for me, right? What public housing is to you is not public housing to me. Our relationship to place and land is very complicated. Our survival in place is revolutionary and rare. There are some places in the United States where a Black person's life expectancy is in the 60s. Imagine living your life being told to go through 25, 30 years of college, knowing that once you're done, maybe you'll get another 15 years to enjoy life, right? Our existence is rare and revolutionary in these conditions. Our posture in the midst of urbanism is for our own sake, not for everyone else's civility or peace of mind or convenience or funding arguments' sake. It's for our own sake, right? We celebrate, we bring in joy, we crack jokes. I know you all are seeing how we act on social media when serious things happen. We always got a joke on Black Twitter about what's going on. But that's not to make it easier for you to consume our trauma and death. That's so that we can remain connected to our own humanity. So if you are here, or if you are in the world and you need to be convinced of, or you need to bear witness to, or you need proof of our trauma, then first lesson of the day is you're part of the problem. Okay, so I sat really long and hard and thought really long and hard about whether or not I want to run through the list of all the types of trauma Black people experience in the built environment. And first of all, it was traumatizing me putting the slides together. But second of all, I just don't know that in this day and age, if I want to continue to give talks to people who are oblivious to or need to see images and see data about the trauma that's happening, right? Now we're ready to do something about it. Those of you who know me, or have those of you who've taken the Dignity Institute, know that I am 100% fascinated with James Baldwin. In fact, I keep a big picture of him in my home, and I have transcripts of his speeches blown up and hanging on my walls. I love James Baldwin. There's a debate he had in 1965. He debated William F. Buckley. Excuse my puppy. He debated William F. Buckley. And the debate was about the condition of Black people in America. And so although I am about to read you a substantial portion of his closing statement in that debate, the statement is much longer, so I didn't feel bad about pulling this little piece of it out, because I feel like this is one of the rare instances where on a main stage, we were really talking about the connection between the condition Black people are in America and the intentional construct of urbanism, and how we have come to relegate Black people to certain spaces in our cities. So here goes. If the city of New York were able, as it has indeed been able in the last 15 years, to reconstruct itself, tear down buildings and raise great new ones, downtown and for money, and has done nothing whatever except build housing projects in the ghetto for the Negroes, and of course, Negroes hate it. Presently, the property does indeed deteriorate because the children cannot bear it. They want to get out of the ghetto. If the American pretensions were based on more solid and more honest assessment of life and of themselves, it would not mean for Negroes when someone says urban renewal that Negroes Negroes are going to be thrown out into the streets. This is just what it means now. This is not an act of God. We're dealing with a society made and ruled by men. Had the American Negro not been present in America, I'm convinced the history of the American labor movement will be much more edifying than it is. It's a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until that moment, until the moment comes when we, the Americans, we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and Black, that on the continent we're trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I'm not an object of missionary charity. I'm one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there's scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it by their very presence will wreck it. And if that happens, it's a very grave moment for the West. And what James Baldwin is trying to tell us here, he's way more eloquent than I am. He's my favorite writer. What he's trying to tell us here is that we never acknowledge, when we're talking about Black people in America, that their relationship to the United States comes by way of deep trauma, rape, pillaging, right? We have this whole construct of racism that informs our decision-making and our level of investment and the criminality of people and how far someone will go academically and how clean their air and water can be, right? We have this construct of race and don't acknowledge that by way of the trauma we've been put through, our ancestors are also white, right? And so it's this belief that if you relegate Black people to some equity exercise, like affordable housing, right? Or free access to the scooters. If you relegate Black folks to a charity version of the aspirational whiteness that is the built environment. We're supposed to celebrate that and love it the way everyone else loves their normative access to space and mobility. But what folks don't realize is, until we can truly see ourselves as a part of the American experiment in a way that's not tied to trauma, we would be nonsensical to not be invested in the literal destruction and end to all of the systems that have caused us trauma and harm before. We just happen to be graceful and full of joy while navigating that reality. Here's what the Into Bondage and James Baldwin debate taught us. People who've been harmed by the racist legacy of land use can't even take the American exercise of urban planning seriously in the absence of a true centering of Black people and Black priorities, and an end to all the processes with ties to the legacy of racism and slavery. That's a tough pill to swallow, right? This idea that I can't even seriously participate in these processes. This is why we have a lot of apathy about voting. This is why we have a lot of resistance to the vaccine. This is why there is skepticism about mobility, new mobility interventions coming to the hood. I can't take this seriously until you get rid of the processes that led to my condition in the first place, right? Because our condition is one that's been constructed. It's not happenstance. Our true condition is this: celebration and joy. We know that to be true because of how we show up during trauma. So our suffering, us having lower incomes and lower and less access to generational wealth and poor health outcomes, this isn't by virtue of our Blackness. These are conditions that have been constructed and imposed on us, right? Another thing that they teach us is neither public joy or open strife are owed to those who make cities. Now, what do I mean by this? Anyone who's like me gets really excited when a project that we've been working on starts to get close to implementation. It's a great idea. I think it's going to benefit a lot of people. I did all the studies. I know that it's going to reduce traffic-related deaths or give more people access to food. Well-meaning, right? When I gaze into the eyes of a resident that says, thank you, but no thank you, and doesn't want to hear my justification for why I think this project is good, I have to accept that because I'm aware of the legacy that predates my project, right? So nobody owes you buy-in to your innovation or your exciting open streets concept or your al fresco dining. People are allowed to be skeptical of those things. And your work is not to convince them not to be. Your work is to get rid of the systems that sowed the seed of skepticism. Okay? We have an innate ability, we meaning Black people, to navigate space. We just do, right? And it's not biological. It is also constructed because of the conditions we've been asked to live in for generations. Follow the drinking gourd, look to the North Star. I often tell this anecdote about when I lived in Chicago, every generation of people gave directions in the city in a way that I had never heard before. You would ask someone, how can I get to Harold's Chicken? And they'll tell you, you need to go 2 meters north and then go southwest 1 meter, and all of these metrics that I'm not familiar with. And I remember calling my mother and saying, I can't even get to the pizza shop here because everyone is giving me the astrological version of GPS. And my mom said, this comes from trauma. There's a time, which still exists today, where not knowing how to navigate the street with a sense of purpose, not having a photographic memory of the landscape, not being aware of the assets that are in your community and the neighbors that you can trust, could be a matter of life or death. And that was really sobering for me, this idea that I come from a lineage of people who know landscapes like the back of their hand, not because they love maps like I do as a planner, but because you have to do that in order to exist. So I want to talk to you a little bit about, as I mentioned before, I decided not to show pictures of Black folks suffering today. But I do want to talk to you a little bit about Black people's experience with urbanism's experiment in the United States. So when we talk about the issue of homelessness, I refer to people who are homeless as people who are unhoused in order to properly attribute accountability. We talk about unhoused people and the incongruence between, one, the available housing stock, which I don't know what the current statistic is, but last year, I want to say upwards of 60% of the United States available housing stock was unoccupied, right? We have 3 times the amount of vacant units than the number of people who are unhoused in the United States. And when you break that down, those numbers down, what we see is most white people are housed in the United States, right? Most. In different places, that number is different. Well, on the flip side, most Asian Pacific Islanders, right? Black folks are unhoused or transiently housed. Think about what it means to have more than half of a population of people not knowing where they're going to sleep tonight or next week or next month, right? This is not by accident. Also, probably not a shocker, is Black people have a very high likelihood of being incarcerated at some point in their life. I cannot remember the statistic offhand, but I remember it being pretty high, 40, 50% chance of going to jail at some point. And when you look at per capita, the number of people who are in jail, we see that per capita, Black people take up the majority of space in our prison systems. And now some people, they'll usually respond to this statistic and say, no, when you look at the population of people in jail, majority of people in jail are white. Well, that's because majority of people in the United States are white. But per capita, the likelihood of going to jail or being incarcerated is really high if you're Black or if you are in proximity to Blackness. Also, more likely to be killed by police. Should not be a shocker at this point, right? And so why am I going through this? Because these disparities don't just indicate some, ethereal inequity that, we all, our hopes and prayers, our thoughts are with you, and we hope you're able to resolve it at some point. This is our work as planners. This is our doing. When we talk about people not having access to homes, this is an issue with land use policy. This is an issue with zoning. This is an issue with the incentives and trade-offs we offer out-of-town developers, because today we want to see high-speed rail, right? This is a result of us creating so many conditions and normative notions of what it means to be human in the built environment, that we're making those who are not normative, meaning Eurocentric or white, more likely to be criminalized. These are our policies doing this. When I think about The loss of Dijon Kizzee, which happened in Los Angeles in 2020, Dijon Kizzee was riding a bike in South Central LA. His autopsy shows several bullets entering his body through his back. The initial police report, which was of course changed into a series of lies, the initial police report indicates he was being pursued for violation of Los Angeles bicycle code. As a city planner in Los Angeles, I wasn't even aware that we had a bicycle code. Right? So these are our policies doing this. When we talk about Black folks being more likely to be killed by police, we're not even just talking about the local police department. We're talking about the full gamut of those who we've given rights and permissions to police Black and brown bodies, right? So when I'm talking about police, I'm not just talking about the police department. I'm talking about the DCSF people who come and get your child against your will when you have a community dispute. I'm talking about the people the traffic officers who give you a ticket for parking 13 and a half inches away from the curb instead of 13. I am talking about the vigilantes who police you without even being police because they're just uncomfortable with your presence, right, in the space. This is what happened with Trayvon Martin. This is what happened with Ahmaud Arbery. The culture of policing shows up in our practices as city makers and as urban planners. What's disgusting about all of these statistics, and what the obvious question for me, maybe not for you, but obvious question for me is, who's making the decisions, right? What do we need to change? Well, we need to change who's working in these positions, first of all. We need to change the people who are making the decisions that lead to these kind of outcomes. And the future looks pretty bleak if that's our strategy, because Black people make up less than 2% of the United States technical city making staff. 2% is me being generous too. I think it's less than 2%. When we're talking about Black women who are business owners, because a lot of the urban planning workforce is private enterprise. Talk about Black women being business owners in this field, we make up 0.02%, which is not scientifically significant enough to really quantify. My first year coming home from Fisk University in Nashville, and I'm a California kid, so coming home from college for like spring break or summer was like really difficult to do because it was expensive. So my first time coming home from college, I was sitting on the couch by myself in our apartment in the Bay Area in Alameda, watching probably cartoons still, because I went to college early. I was still young. I was like 17. And we get a no-knock raid. The Alameda County Sheriff's Department kicks in our door, battering ram, and they have AR-15 rifles pointing at me. I'm alone in the home, and they're shouting all of these demands: get down, get up, hands down, don't move, come over here. And of course, my life is flashing before my eyes, and I'm really traumatized. Also unclothed, which was and I was worried about so many things. And they're telling me that they're here because they're looking for someone who has a warrant, which is like, you're not here looking for someone with a warrant. I was just coming home from college. My older brother has been away at college for several years. My mother herself was away. She used to go out of town for school because she was working on her PhD while I was in undergrad. So our apartment it rarely had anyone in it. Very traumatic experience. What coincided with that incident was our 600-unit apartment complex in Alameda, California. For anyone who's not familiar with it, the city is a 5-mile radius, very small. You could get from one end to the other in 7 minutes, maybe less. The whole complex, 600 families, have been sold to a developer in Florida. And of course, they realized they had made a mistake, or they knew they were making a mistake. But, a couple of days later, they said, oh, our bad, it was the wrong house. In that same week, we received a 45-day eviction notice because the property had been sold and they wanted to transform that complex into condominiums. My whole life, I have lived with PTSD because of that moment. Even right now, as I'm speaking to you, you probably notice that I keep looking over my shoulder. Every tick of the clock in the corner reminds me of the sounds I heard at the door that day. When people walk past my door, I never feel excitement about who's coming to visit. When the mailman comes and throws a package, I am startled. I'm shook, right? I have lived my whole life with PTSD because of this incident. But I never spoke about it because I've always felt that if I tell anyone the story about the time my ghetto apartment had the door kicked in and I was traumatized, all people would focus on is, oh, Destiny grew up in the ghetto. So I've carried the shame of this. And it wasn't until the death of Breonna Taylor last year when I realized no-knock raids, when I was validated, because I've always just known this, but I wasn't validated until the story of Breonna Taylor, when her lawyers spoke about briefly in like a CNN interview, the likelihood that no-knock raid would not have happened if her community wasn't currently being gentrified. And I remember watching social media and people thinking, like, why would he say that? He has no proof of that. How does he know that? And here we are denying the legacy that Black people know in this country. Even with my PTSD, I have to find statistics for my colleagues to know that, yes, this type of collusion at the city level really does happen. There are tables where the police department sits with the planning department and the transportation planning department and the metro, and to talk about how they can terrorize these communities out of their properties. This really happens. So I want to share a clip with you. Vice News did an investigation on this. I'm only going to share 5 minutes of it, but I want you to hear the discourse and the dialogue that's unfolding in this clip so that you can get a deeper understanding of our roles as city makers in the trauma that our young people and our Black folks in the United States and our brown folks and indigenous folks are encountering as a result of our aspirations for smart cities.
The question is, did we in fact allow a department other than the mayor's office
to give direction to the police department about where to do an investigation, not based on where the crime seemed to be, but instead based on this particular location?
They're talking about what you uncovered.
Mm-hmm. And it's true.
3 weeks ago, Breonna Taylor's case took an unexpected turn when her family's lawyer, Sam Aguiar, filed a new complaint alleging that Taylor's death was tied to a redevelopment program led by the mayor's office. Within days, the city's Metro Council led a bipartisan effort to demand answers from Mayor Greg Fisher himself.
I was shocked when I read the allegations, and I think Councilman Kramer was too.
All I can do is say that we want the information. There seems to be a strange set of circumstances that came together, and we need to find out why.
I don't know if I'd call it strange.
What word would you use?
Catastrophic.
On the night Breonna Taylor was killed, the Louisville Metro Police Department targeted 5 properties they believed to be connected to a larger drug operation. Taylor's apartment on Springfield Drive, a home on Muhammad Ali Boulevard, and 3 homes on a single block of Elliott Avenue, which are the focus of Aguiar's new complaint. It alleges that the LMPD went on a crusade to target people and homes on a small stretch of Elliott Avenue because the city was hoping to take over properties for a real estate development project there. And that LMPD did it by dedicating to the area a previously unknown police unit called Place-Based Investigations, or PBI, which was formed in late 2019.
I was not aware that there was a place-based police unit that was focusing on that area to do X, Y, or Z.
The PBI unit, they're the ones that get the occupants of this Elliott house every single time. And if your job as a unit is to go to the heaviest, most saturated criminal syndicate neighborhoods in Louisville that does not encompass Elliott Avenue. Let's put two and two together. Houses are being torn down. There's a city plan clearly to rebuild. And you've got one little trap house that you decide needs to go. This PBI was 6 plainclothes officers and undercover vehicles driving up and down the road all day long. I mean, it was targeted harassing policing. Getting to the point where you need to hit 5 houses with over 70 police officers in a single night, that's crazy. Let's see, I just got a text message. Press conference at Elliott at 4:30 today.
You saw that the mayor is going to do a counter press conference?
It's going to be his first time talking.
Thanks everybody for coming out here to Elliott Avenue. My reaction when I saw the assertions from Sam Aguiar about Elliott Avenue were I was dumbfounded to see the linkage of this initiative here of trying to rebuild this block with safe and affordable housing was somehow tied into a nefarious objective with Breonna Taylor's tragedy. So what we're trying to do in neighborhoods like Russell is regenerate without displacement. And that has been on the record for months. You guys all know about that. The main takeaway is this is a neighborhood that needs help. It's being developed by a guy that's been doing this for a long time.
The plans to redevelop Elliott Avenue are part of a multi-million-dollar initiative called Vision Russell. It consists of multiple projects to reshape the predominantly Black West End, including demolishing the city's largest public housing complex, Beecher Terrace, and rebuilding it into mixed-income housing. Mayor Fisher maintains that the Elliott Avenue development, led by Develop Louisville, is completely separate from LMPD investigations.
Mayor, did you or anyone in your administration have any conversations with LMPD's PBI or anybody in the LMPD command staff to have PBI come and focus on Elliott Avenue?
We had no specific conversation with them. They're following the evidence in the case, place-based investigation, PBI.
Mayor Fisher, do you
that they don't argue that this project isn't great, but it's more specific to how the PBI has gone about, addressing this area. They're asking for documents explaining what the PBI has been looking at. And can you talk about just the process behind how they've been operating?
Well, I'm surprised council doesn't know about that because they're briefed regularly on police activity. But any information that is not precluded, that we're not precluded from releasing because of the criminal investigation that the AG and the FBI are involved with, we absolutely will release all that information.
So I'm telling you all of this because there is very clearly the grips of Jim Crow, the legacy of slavery is all over our field. Those fingerprints are all over the work that we do. A lot of us do this work altruistically and are just simply unaware of what we think are normal ways of being in our field are actually very systematic and strategic efforts to displace and to cause harm to Black and brown folks. And so at the Thrivance Group, there are 3 ways that we are going about resolving this legacy of harm. Unmaking urbanism. So for those of you who haven't registered for the Urbanist Assembly, I encourage you to go to unurbanist.com. That is a 100% free learning community. It happens once a year for 23 hours straight where we talk about what it means to unmake urbanism. We also take a harm reductive approach to community design and engagement. And then lastly, we are championing and working on a framework for what we call spatial reparations that we hope local city officials as well as residents in each community that's going through what my neighborhood and what Breonna Taylor's neighborhood are going through can pick those guidelines up and help to self-determine what happens in their communities. When we talk about unmaking urbanism, what we're really talking about is redefining and reclassifying what it means to be qualified to be a city maker. When I went through my most recent civil service process, it took me 6 to 8 months to get through the process. I had to, in addition to turning in and meeting the basic requirements, I had to give an annotated description of the specific class that I took that meets the requirement that exists in a traditional planning program. And because I went to a historically Black college, I had to undergo an additional layer of scrutiny. In fact, I had to prove that I had a PhD 3 different ways. I had to bring my certificate. I'd take my certificate out of the frame, bring that in. I had to get a letter from my school, and then I had to share my transcript, official copies of my transcript, just to get paid, you know, at an equitable rate. These things are nonsensical, right? And going back to Aaron Douglas's painting, we know that there is a deep connection that most of us have to the communities that we live in and are from, right? So a lot of what we think is required academically naturally exists and is embodied in our understandings of the places we live in. So we are working in several ways to help redefine what it means to be an urban planner and what it takes to become one. So we do that through our dignity-infused community engagement and planning approach, where we literally build capacity with residents at the community level. We take all of our technical knowledge and we give it to folks for free so that they can show up in a planning process with more access to power. We also champion the removal of all notions of surveillance and enforcement from the profession. We don't think, I mean, we really believe in the value of city making as a profession. So we don't think that, we believe that we can engineer and innovate and create our ways out of some of the issues that we seek to resolve through surveillance and enforcement. We also want to exempt political will as an influencing factor in meeting the basic needs and rights of communities and immigrants. Those of you who've heard me speak before know that I truly believe that things like mobility, housing, access to food, these are public utilities, just like water, you know, plumbing, air. These are public works that should not be subject to the political will or having to meet some threshold of political will in order for communities and residents to get what they need. Lastly, when we say unmake urbanism, what we're talking about is applying an integrated, multidisciplinary, and critical analysis to all city making exercises. One of my favorite colleagues is Jose Richard, who is also a dancer, but a planner and a social worker, right? And I'm always thinking about the magic of a concept that can come out of a person that understands choreography, right? And that is masterful at it. Or me as a painter, having the photographic memory that I have, I'm able to do a design exercise with much more ease than someone who is having to go through the processes that they were taught in planning school, right? And then also coupling that with an understanding of sociological, anthropological, historical context, and all of the social sciences really helps us to get to a notion of urban planning that's human-centered. We also champion harm reduction. So there are 4 elements of harm reduction, or we call it like a lens or our layer of analysis that we apply to our work. The incident that I shared with you about the no-knock raid that I experienced, or what communities are going through or have gone through, like in the incident with George Floyd. What we can't forget is that in addition to the adults experiencing a lot of trauma and suffering, the young people who are growing up in this era are going to have very negative health outcomes as adults as a result of what they have experienced. And ACEs, for those of you who want to look further into it, there are studies on the effects of adverse childhood experiences and how they manifest in adulthood. And we see in Black bodies, life expectancy reduced to the 60s, and maybe in some places you might get to the low 70s because of the adverse childhood experiences that we encounter as youth. And so harm reduction is a very important and necessary layer of analysis in our approach to city making and planning. For us, this means including a set of strategies and ideas that are aimed at reducing the negative consequences of the past and of the work we are doing in the moment. We believe harm reduction is a movement for social justice that is built on the belief in and respect for the rights of people, and that we should meet them where they are while also addressing their condition, right? The conditions that they're in, without placing judgment on the fact that they're in those conditions. Harm reduction demands that the interventions and policies we're proposing reflect the individual and community needs, right? So we can't apply a blanket approach to a community that has a legacy of harm because that's not a human-centric or harm reductive way. We'll continue to end up with the same outcomes if we don't. And that lastly, harm reduction tells us and is a constant reminder that there's no universal definition or formula for implementing a harm reductive approach. What this means is you have to have deep community engagement. You have to be working with communities to ask them what they need to feel whole, to feel dignified, to feel human. And it is those responses that should inform and drive your approach in the community, not what you learned in school. Lastly, we believe in spatial reparations. We have a project at the Thrivance Group called Comprehensive Package for Reparations Through Urbanism, and the acronym is CPR-U. And for us, any intervention that we're looking at, if it's a part of our a city's intentional effort to atone for the legacy of slavery and racism, it has to have these 4 elements in it. It has to address a specific harm or a specific element of harm, right? So you have to name what type of harm you're addressing. You can't have one thing that is attempting to atone for the entire gamut of slavery, right? Name the harm that we're experiencing today as a result of slavery, and let's address that. It has to identify a specific and intentional recipient of the compensation, right? So we have poor air quality in South Central LA because of redlining and the legacy of Jim Crow, which stems from slavery. My dog's trying to tell me to take him outside, sorry. Which stems from slavery, right? So now that we've named that harm, the question is, who are we compensating? That's not everyone. That's not all people of color. That's not everyone in South Central LA, right? And it's really important when you're doing atonement work to name who you're atoning with. The third thing is that whatever your eligibility or qualifying factors are, they can't be attached to an existing additional system of oppression. So giving more money to the police department to convince them to stop killing Black children in South Central LA is not an appropriate approach to reparations for slavery or its legacy in that community, right? And then lastly, it has to intend to create a permanent redress for the irrevocable condition that we've experienced, right? Irrevocable condition is a term that I get from James Baldwin. You could look that one up. That's a good reading to do. But it's this idea, right? Just like the story that I shared, that no matter how happy I am in the moment, I could be in paradise in Hawaii somewhere, I could be on somebody's beach. if I hear that click at the door, I'm traumatized, right? So some of us have to realize that the condition emotionally and socially and spiritually that some of us are in is irrevocable. So the question that you ask yourself is, how can I be compassionate and plan around that irrevocable condition? So at least there's balance in how this person experiences the built environment. So as you can see, I could go on and on and on and on about this. There's tons to learn. I encourage you to register at unurbanist.com to hear not just from me, but from my colleagues. Our keynote speaker this year will be Bakari Sellers, who was a CNN contributor, but also a beloved social justice advocate for the movement of Black lives in this country. And I hope to see you there and to continue this conversation on that platform. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for the very informative presentation and for really going into depth and helping us understand a lot of the underlying conditions that exist, and oftentimes we don't frequently relate the environment to these conditions. We have a series of questions, but for one, for the Urbanist Assembly, I know that I think Monika posted in the chat the link to it, but when is that?
Thank you for asking. That's going to be it starts on June 18th in the morning, depending on what time zone you're in, it's going to be at a different time. I think it starts at 8 or 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And it literally lasts 23 hours straight, no breaks, and we don't record any of it. We don't share it later. You have to be there to know, you have to be there to experience it. It's a digital teach-in. And the history of that is last year when I have comorbidities, so I couldn't go out and protest with everyone. I actually did end up getting COVID, and it hit me just as hard as I thought it would if I ever contracted it. And so I staged a virtual teach-in last year because I was so frustrated with how my colleagues were unwilling to talk about the connection between urbanism and the issues that we were protesting outside. And so I created a virtual space. I thought that I would, filibuster for 23 hours straight. And luckily, so many people from the field reached out and said, we're not going to let you carry that space alone. We'll be there with you all 23 hours. And so I actually only ended up having to present officially for an hour. And for the other 22 hours, I was accompanied by colleagues from around the world. We had 8,000 participants globally last year, and we are on track to have about 10,000 people this year.
That's wonderful, and I love the fact that you have to be present. So if you value it enough, you take the time and you participate. That's wonderful. We have a comment by Mary Staropoulos. Dr. Thomas, this has been an amazing mind-expanding presentation. Thank you so very much. My questions are related to mobility justice. What do you think about that term? Do you think it has value? How would you define it? There's 500 questions, Mary. Do you think that the meaning differs from the community to community? So I know that you do quite a bit of work in the transportation sector. So Mary is involved with Reconnect Rochester, a partner organization that we collaborate quite often, working in transit advocacy. So share what you can share with us about that.
Yeah, I like and appreciate this question, Mary. So anything with the word justice behind it is worth a deep dive. I think when we say the term justice, of course, we probably all mean different things. But from what I know about the sort of like overarching movement for mobility justice is that those principles and those values stem from the legacy of social justice work and civil rights work in this country. So to that end, I think the term is great. What I push back on sometimes is the idea of what it means to be mobile or what mobility means for certain people. I think our understanding of mobility, especially when it comes to Black and Brown people, is usually very aspirational and normative, right? So you usually, when people are saying mobility or mobility justice, they're referencing having access to transit that's free or affordable, or being able, hopefully they mean being able to move about without being killed by police or vigilantes. But what I think is missing from the analysis is what is mobility, because intra-community connectivity is way more important to me than being able to commute 20 miles away on a free train even, or a free bus, to labor hard only to have to take that long trip back home. And so for me, mobility is not just what's on wheels or what's on feet. Mobility means not having to carry the burden of mobility, the disproportionate burden of movement in Black and Brown communities that we currently experience. So proximity is important to me, as opposed to just having access to a place. I want that place to be near me versus having to travel to it. I guess that answers how I define mobility justice. My framework for justice comes from a couple of places. I'm rooted in womanist praxis, which is a type of Black feminism that centers not just Black women, but the network of family and relationship and love, which Black women don't often get enough of. And so that's like an important framework for me that I pull from. I also do pull a lot from critical race studies, particularly intersectionality, but also Thrivance theory is a critical race theory that I was blessed to be able to work with Kimberly Crenshaw on when I was in my doctoral program. And then also I come from a family of former and current Black Panther Party members. So my understanding of justice is probably a little bit different from what we mean when we say mobility justice. I do think that the meaning differs from community to community, but I think there is an opportunity for us to all coalesce under an umbrella of values that kind of gets us all one step closer in each of our communities to our self-determined notion of justice. And so People for Mobility Justice is like a good group to look into if you're looking for those sort of overarching principles. But I would also say the Black Space is a good organization to check into, and the Black Manifesto is also good to check into. Should Rochester work to develop our own definition for what it means to community? Yes, if your process for doing so won't take you away from attending to the immediate need and relief from suffering in your community.
Great. Yeah, Mary, that was a huge question. Our board president, Bill Price, wants to know, what do you mean by remove surveillance and enforcement from the profession? Are you talking about education verification and or continuing education requirements?
No. I'm talking about removing surveillance and enforcement from the urban planning space entirely, right? So when we create a new park, usually in that discussion, someone says, how are we going to keep people safe in the park? And our only framework for safety is we need to add cameras and we need to call the police and see what they want to do, right? And so we as people who are trained innovators and creative and can make magic with lines and curves need to think differently about what it means to keep people safe in the spaces that we're designing and building. And I just want to encourage and stretch people to think beyond surveillance and policing as mechanisms for safety and comfort.
Thank you. I know we often hear, for example, on neighborhood streets, that oftentimes people engaging in their community is limited by their sense of perceived safety. And one of those answers is, well, the more people are on the street, the more you have people active on the street, then the safer you feel, because there are people around you who see and who hear and who can engage with you. So that's one interesting aspect. I took so many notes during your presentation. I love the comment about how access to transportation represents a certain freedom, but also, I mean, I think that's understood in many ways, but also this sense of maturity, right? The sense of autonomy, I guess, is important. And your point about the fact that not everyone, and this is certainly a point I've taken for granted, that not everyone has the access that I have.
Yeah.
So how can you tell me how, in the work that you're doing, how are you able to increase access, or how can we as planners try to identify and directly address this issue of access, equitable access?
So I think spatially equitable access, like inequitable access, is a manifestation of inaccessible processes, right? So if, like, the reason I can't access a space is probably because you didn't ask me what I needed in the space when you created it, right? And so that statistic about only 2% of planners being Black, you could turn that question around and say, like, who else is saying they don't have equitable access to place, right? And also, let's expand our notion of accessibility, because ADA is not even the tip of the iceberg, right? Access is, of course, about mobility, but it's also about cognitive access. It's about cultural and social access, right? So there are so many things that make a space inaccessible. And the people who are saying I can't access this space or don't feel comfortable accessing it are usually the people who we have chosen not to hire to make the decisions about what to do with the space. So I think that that's the first step. But I also, as a designer, talk a lot about moving away from rigid notions of spatial design. So designing spaces that are intentionally fluid in terms of their function, designing spaces that have a degree of permanence to them, but also that permanence is flexible, right? So why can't folks live outside, right? Why don't you want people living in the park, right? And if we were to ask ourselves and unpack that question, then the question becomes, what does it mean to live somewhere? Does it mean you have access to cooking space? Does it mean you have access to somewhere to use the bathroom? Does it mean you have access to sit down with your family or with your friends to socialize? Those questions lead to a type of design that may not look like a tent in a park, right? But people who occupy tents in parks would still have access to that park in a way that wouldn't necessitate them bringing a tent with them. Put the kitchen outside, you know? So I think thinking about design in ways that we're creating permanence in a space, because I do believe that routine and structure and tradition are important. But in that permanence, having more than one utility to a space is how we get to equity and access.
Before we get too far away, Ellen Oberst makes a comment. He says, I love Bill Price's question and Dr. Thomas's answer. As a veteran of many rail trail projects, and one of the most common tactics of trail opponents is to say, how are you going to patrol this? So that's a great example, Alan, of surveillance in our environment. The idea that there has to be a way to watch everyone all the time is so corrosive. So thank you, Alan, for that comment. My friend Richard Gleaser has a question for you. It says, we are experiencing redevelopment of our downtown, Innovation Square, Parcel 5 in Sibley, and there is a striking absence of African-American communities' engagement in its future design. Everything seems to be driven by a white traditional developer model. Are there any words of advice to be un-urbanist, something practical? City Hall doesn't seem to be aware.
I mean, this is a whole consultation meeting to answer this question, but I will tell you that Black folks are right to be suspicious of our processes. We can't be asking Black folks to participate in our creative exercises. Get down, Diggy. Well, come on, come up here. Excuse my puppy. We can't be asking people to participate in our creative exercises if we haven't acknowledged and addressed the harm that's come before. So I just would recommend, separate from this project, thinking about what it looks like to take on a transformative justice approach to atoning for the legacy of racism in that space. And then also, we're going through hell right now, all of us. We're coming out of the pandemic. We're, I think, on the brink of major economic downturn. There's so much ambiguity politically in the air. And so like, it's also that Black people have the most, not the most, but a lot at stake right now. And so this might just not be a priority for them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine.
Susan Mayer states, land banks are used by cities to find a way to build larger projects. It doesn't necessarily lead to home ownership and building wealth. What is your opinion of land banks and how best would a city use it?
Great question. So I love community ownership concepts. We're actually working on a cooperative mobility hub framework, because it's the land banks don't lead to generational wealth, but they can lead to generational wealth in a community that has a legacy of housing instability and burden, right? So it's not that the land itself helps to generate wealth, but it's the relief of burden that gives people more headspace and more time to access wealth, separate from that. So there's that, but then also, I don't think we've experimented with community ownership models long enough to really say with definity that they don't lead to generational wealth. We're only 2 generations outside of slavery, 2, right? And we're not even a full generation away from Jim Crow. So let's give these concepts a little bit more time to see whether or not they're viable. One of the issues that we encountered with the cooperative model, especially in the Bay Area, is that the elders who own it definitely, are able to keep the property over time, but because they're elders, don't have access to maintenance and to do manual labor in a way that helps maintain the integrity of the space and to keep up with the development happening around it. So that's how those spaces become get handed back over to the city, or we lose the value of them. And so, yeah, this is a problem. And we're trying to think about a model that's multi-generational, but I just think we are not far enough removed from the trauma of slavery and Jim Crow to really have expectations of these models to be effective in the ways that we think they'll be. We just need more time.
Thank you. There's one question, and I haven't been ignoring it. I just wanted to save it for last as we're running out of time. And I do have just a few closing slides after we finish. But with this question, how does your art influence your work? I thought this would be a wonderful way to close.
It is my work. Thank you for asking. I don't lead with like I'm an artist in my introduction. It's not in my bio, but I'm actually dyslexic. I lived for a long time with that learning difference, and no, it wasn't until college that someone thought to like help me. But so what that meant was I got through life with art. I got through life using a photographic memory, fell in love with shapes, colors, texture, the environment, like nature. And so, yeah, it's how I think. So it's in everything that I do. But it's also how I escape. I have a pretty cool collection of artwork that I'm thinking about selling soon.
I think that the world would be such a wonderful place if we all approached our planning processes and the way we create space, as through an artist's perspective. So, Dr. Thomas, it's been such a pleasure to learn more about the work that you're doing and the things that you are trying, that you are committed to influencing. So we look forward to continued engagement, and certainly really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us today.
Thank you. Be well, everyone.
And so in closing, we just want to make you aware of, we have our upcoming follow-up conversation for next week on Wednesday, noon to 1, with Reverend Myra Brown will be joining us to help facilitate that conversation. We hope that you will join us again next month for our next lecture featuring June Grant, speaking about justice, equity, and the new community. This presentation will be our annual Roger Brown lecture. And again, I want to take this time to thank Dr. Thomas and especially thank all of you for spending the time with us today. We hope you'll join us again next week. And we look forward to our community conversation next week. Please respond to our survey and have a wonderful, wonderful day, everyone.